So we're here with Dr. Ana Perez-Chisti, and we'll be talking about emotions and Sufism. I'm very glad to present this to our class because I think this is a very special treat. You'll be reading a lot of Buddhism and emotions, particularly with the book Destructive Emotions, and reading about the Dalai Lama. But this is a treat because we have a Sufi lineage holder that can really talk about more of a monotheistic, mystical tradition and emotions, which can be very different. And actually, I would even invite Ana so that we're all on the same page, tell us a little bit about her tradition and where she comes from.
Thanks so much for asking me, Ryan. This is a great privilege to be with you all, class, and talk about a subject that's very dear to my heart and has been one of the great dedications of my life since I have been working as a student of Sufism for over 40 years. So first to tell you a little bit about my background, about the background of the Sufi path that we follow, which was brought to the West by a great Sufi master named Hazrat Inayat Khan. He came to the West around 1910, bringing four-school Sufism from the Middle East, and this was basically Persia and India, these primary areas. And the four schools that he integrated in the mystic esoteric traditions were the Naqshbandi, the Surwadi, the Chistis, and the Qadiris. Now, each of these groups functioned in the Middle Eastern area and in Northern Africa. For instance, the Qadiris were a Northern African community. The Chistis migrated to India, and the Surwadis and the Naqshbandis really come from northern Iran, or Iraq as we know today. These areas were filled with great Sufi masters that integrated their teachings and migrated out of the great wars and upheavals, such as Rumi, who had to leave Anatolia due to the infiltrations of armies and Mughals and rampant communities that were really killing off the elite and the educated. So they migrated out of the countries, and that's exactly what these Sufi masters did. In order to appropriate their Sufi teachings, they migrated to different countries. But it was in Hazrat Inayat Khan actually came to meet his master Hashim Mahmud Madani in India, and it was through the master Madani that he received the synthesis of the four schools of Sufism and realized the esoteric principles that united them and then brought them to the West. And that is the school of Sufism that I follow, and it's under the rubric of the Sufi Movement International at this point, with relative centers in Holland and Geneva and the United States. So those are our basic community centers. Of course, we have centers all over the world, in Russia and in Italy and as far north as Finland and as far south as Mexico and South America and Australia and New Zealand, etc. I mean, it's a world community, but there's no proselytization in Sufism. So, there's a saying in Sufism. There are two actually. One is very funny, coming from the dervish, and the other is much more mystical. The funny one is that the dervish say that if you always want to know if the band of Sufis are in town, you make sure you can smell the camel dung, and then you'll know they're there, and then you have to just sniff them out where they are. The other story that comes from more esoteric lore, and you'll see this in Rumi's work, is that if you smell the scent of roses, you'll know that the Sufis are near. So, one is very beautiful and the other is a little bit more basic, but you have to understand that the movement of Sufism is not a doctrinal system. If I were to evoke the sense of the Sufi mystical tradition, which I hope will come through in these questions that Ryan, Dr. Rominger, has presented to me, you would see that there are several components in which one can address how a Sufi moves through the doctrines, uniting them all, without isolating or moving into camps, that the ideal always behind the brotherhood and sisterhood of Sufism was to find the essence of the essence of the essence. As the Masnawi by Rumi is called the roots of the roots of the roots. So, the idea behind the Sufi principles are always to move into the deeper insight of what motivates action and emotion and cognition, not to define what cognition and emotion are. So my responses will be in these areas. But just to give you a little bit of an imagery that could help you understand some of the principles of how Sufism works, if we were to put on an altar across time and space, let's call it the ocean of the unconscious, as Jung would state, and we would have in this ocean arising lotuses appearing at the top of the water, with its root that goes down into the mud of the ocean, the very floor ocean. There would be many lotuses, and let us call these lotuses for this image the lotus of Hinduism, the lotus of Judaism, the lotus of Zoroastrianism, the lotus of Christianity, the lotus of the pagan goddess stream of teachings, the lotus of the Native American tradition, whatever this altar, whatever you can fit on this great altar of teaching, the Muslim religion, for example. Now, these would be the identifiable streams of which humans have sacrificed their life to bring to the world and have incorporated and held the beauty of human legacy of wisdom and reality. But Sufism would be the pollen that would be in the air that fertilizes the lotus. It has no root, although one can find it historically. If you look at the great Sufi masters, you will see a man or a woman who appeared at a particular period of time giving a legacy of teaching. But really, if you try to get to the base of how this arose, you would have to look into wisdom itself. That's why it's configured Sufism. Yeah, that's right. The epistemology of it really is in the pollen. Right.
So that one of those people being Hazrat Inat Khan,
right,
that we can look at.
That's right.
His lineage.
That's right. You could see the lineage, you could see the influence.
But that doesn't say something about the essence of which he brought forward.
That is right. That is right. So that image has always been a rich image to me to define the mystical traditions of Sufism, because it cannot be a doctrinal system, although there is much written now about it. It was an oral system that was passed down. It was a system of experience. It was utterly somatic in its methodology. And it didn't have the same intellectual experience, although many of the great Sufi mystics, such as Rumi, for instance, Al-Farabi, Averroes, Al-Rushd, who are all great mystics, and Al-Ghazali, the great philosophical Aristotelian philosopher of the 10th century. They were all academics, and they wrote copious amounts of literature. But that didn't mean that is where it resided. It wasn't. Their experience of Sufism did not reside in the cognitive and the written word only. Their experiences and their methodologies were inherently somatic in their application. And their students that followed them had to go under deep disciplines of somatic and emotional and spiritual training in order to arrive at a place of transformation.
Something like we were talking about today in Tom and Henry. So Tom was talking about the experiential and the embodiment and the seems like a transpersonal learning.
Utterly
and
transpersonal.
You're talking about it for eons.
Yes, for eons. That's right. And it's so funny when I think of expanding the transpersonal view out of psychology alone, I could see it embody so many great wisdom traditions that are abiding right now. So it would embrace them completely, even though we do embrace them in transpersonal psychology. When we take the psychology out and we leave just the transpersonal, it could be really vastly embracing of the wisdom traditions of the world. And there are so many that we can count on. So I hope that gives a little bit of an idea of the legacy of the Sufism that I will be referring to, because my responses to the questions that Dr. Rominger has placed before me is based on Hazrat Inayat Khan's synthesis of the four school principles of Sufism. It is also based on the work of Avicenna, a Bukhari Sufi, who was a great healer and wrote a canon of medicine called Al-Qunun, a tremendously important book in which he deals with illness involving the emotions. And since the subject of our conversation is about the emotions, it would be a book that I would recommend very highly that you as a class take a look at. He was a Hanafi Sunni Muslim, per his indication, and his work carried over to influence even the work of Thomas Aquinas. So he had a profound influence on how we look at the integral relationship of emotion and health. So therefore I consider his book very, very important. I would also suggest in the bibliographical references, which I also will be referring to here partway, beside the work of Hazrat Inayat Khan and the Sufi message volumes, which expand from 1 to 14 on all the subjects of the mystical path, one of them being psychology, in which he has sections on the emotions, which I will be using in our exchange today. But this text on psychology by Hazrat Inayat Khan is formative when one would think, as a transpersonalist, that he wrote this in 1910. So you have to take a look at it from a hagiographic perspective, that this was truly groundbreaking material at the time that he brought this through. So if you read that text, you will be, I think, quite amazed at how advanced he is in his ability to understand the field of psychology as we express it today. I also would recommend several other Sufi teachers, which would be Al-Farabi. He was a Turkestani who wrote in 870 A.D. Al-Farabi's work and Al-Ghazali's work, who followed in 1058. Al-Ghazali, of course, one of the great scholars, as well as Al-Farabi, and Averroes from Spain, from Seville, Spain. All these three Sufi writers deal with emotion. They address it, because to a Sufi, the emotion was a very important subject for the level of transformative expression of divine love of God, of Allah. So without emotion, of course, so every one of these writers refer to this subject extremely well and articulately express the ideas of the metaphysical ideas accompanied with psychology. So the medical and they bring it through with, I believe, very contemporary languaging. I think you'll find it very special. Anyway, those are the writers that I would recommend for the correlative readings for Hazrat Inayat Khan.
Great. Thank you. For the class, when I post this up, I'll put it in caucus, and I'll ask you afterwards how to spell some of the names and the book titles and whatnot, so that we can really have that.
Good, and I can give you some of the websites too, which would help the students
great.
access it.
Yes.
Because they would be able to get on it with ease instead of having to order the books. They could get on the website and they can begin to see some of the writings that are now posted on the website.
Great.
Yeah, so I'll make sure to get that to you and add that.
Thank you.
Okay.
So shall we launch into week one?
Absolutely.
Which, for those of you listening, the general gist of week one is, what are emotions? And for Sufism, we're going to look at emotions and how they relate to the nafs, and see where we go from there. So, what are emotions from a Sufi perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not an easy question to start. So I'm going to build a foundation for it, so that we have a kind of a fundamental value system that might work here. So, from a Sufi perspective, the human being is constituted of many parts. And the body is made up of certain fundamental layers of the body which develops the organs and are formed and attuned to certain atoms and vibrations. Now this is seen as a concurrent aspect of the physical form. So it is not only the material body, but it's the vibrations that surround that body and develop also, the organal structure, the skin structure, the cognitive structure, the emotional structure, etc. They're all inherent and together. But there are parts of the body which are especially tuned to vibrations and avenues of the senses. And in this case, the ear, for example, is a specialized organ for hearing, and the eye is a modification of a nerve terminal that relays data into the gray matter of the brain. In neuropsychology, we specialize in studying this and what that actually means.
Yeah. And in cognitive psychology, we call that perception.
That's right. And the tongue is regarded as an organ of taste. Of course, I'm reiterating everything we know. And the organ of touch is validated by being a sensitive system of glands and neurons that submit material into the nervous system and therefore are communicated and translated by the brain. Again, we all study this. But, we have to look at this in the intrinsic value of things when we talk about emotions.
Right.
Because all this is keyed in. And there comes a delicacy to this understanding of this synthesized aspect of our physical body that is controlled and operated through the channels of breath. Now here we get into how the Sufi regards emotion. Because the emotions are never identified as separate in the organal structure of the human being. It's only inherently seen as how the breath moves through these different perceptive channels, or these channels of perception. So all these senses, whether regarded as 5 in the ancient sense or several more in the modern sense, depend upon how the responsiveness to these sections of our body respond to vibrations. Now, the Sufi feels that the vibrations are mandated by how the breath moves through the gross atomic state of being or the finer atomic states of being. And they are more, when they're through the grosser, when the breath moves through the grosser atomic states of being, we relate that to the physical aspects of our nature. When they go through the finer qualities of our being, we speak about this as the higher mental body, let us say, in some Sanskrit terms. They call it the higher mental body. And, we have, the Jabarut, which is spiritual, the spiritual body. There are 3 planes in Sufism, which is the plane of the mental, the plane of the emotional, and the plane of the physical. When we're speaking of the more integrated physical aspects, we're talking about the earth plane body organs.
The mineral vegetative.
The mineral vegetative, right. Those which are operating through the activity of a vibration that surrounds the functions of the atomic system. But when we're talking about the vital body, the body of breath, which surrounds and permeates the body, and which also forms what is called the energetic body, or the aura in Sanskrit terminology, we're talking about a very different manifestation and activity of this body. So with the development of sensitivity and sensation, one has the knowledge of the movement of breath, which is also light and sound, and the elements which spring forth from the breath. And with each activity of breath, there is an association of color. You see this in many of the Hindu practices, in the Buddhist practices, and Sufi practices. They're aligned because color is vibration. One can see this when one dives deep into the sea. When I went down so deep, once all the red light was taken out and only the blue light existed. I was so deep into the sea in Hawaii. And that was a vibratory feeling. I felt that vibrationally. That's kind of like the idea. It's very experiential. It's very somatic. So you can't separate out the cognition of something, even though it affects the cognition greatly. You're actually having a deep emotional experience. So it's one of the finer points.
So cognition and emotion are connected.
Are tightly connected, and that's one of the things that the Sufis have always felt was an important aspect about emotion. That the separation really, and I learned this when I was under tutelage with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. When he would speak about the mind, he always put his hand on his heart. And I asked him afterward, just when we had a chance to ask questions, I asked him why he put his hand on his heart when he used the term mind. And he said, for Buddhists, the mind is the heart, and the heart is the mind. Well, I would say that correlates very much to what Sufi esoteric studies are trying to convey. It's the same principle. It doesn't have an isolation, so to speak. It has an integration. And the integration I'll explain as we kind of move forward here. And the integration is how the breath moves through the will, which affects the cognition. Therefore, in Sufi practice, one of the most important ideas for helping the nafs, which is called the ego nature, is there is a natural tendency of the nafs, or the ego nature, to stress events that are near at hand and to predominate on them. This is just to give you an example. And the circumstances that affect the personality. But the esoteric view, or the spiritual view through a Sufi perspective, does not exclude the human view at all. But according to Sufism, the divine is both personal and unlimited. And therefore, it is not restricted to just a transcendental aspect or state. It's the integration of the states in union, so that the cognitive, for example, and the emotional states are operating in union. So
they haven't been through the dualistic, they haven't been separated out. It's more of an analytical, dualistic perspective as happened through certain Western traditions.
That's right. That's right. And that it has its purpose very strongly. But in the Sufi principles of practice, that purpose is not as significant. And the reason why it's not as significant is because the influence of the integration, when it is related to the practices of concentration, meditation, and mantra recitation, the breath has to inherently engage the atomic system to focus the intention on the ideal. And the ideal, per the esoteric understanding, if it is filled with the love of what you're doing, will hold you fast. So the cognition supports the emotion by holding fast through the emotion of love and devotion, bringing about a very beneficent response in the practitioner. And that beneficent response, because it is so positive, creates an environment that's inherently blessed for that student's awareness to gain expansion, where it's not limiting the practitioner or the student. It's allowing them to engage in a greater and vaster perspective. So the nafs, of course, then become unlimited. The nafs, the small self, or the small s self, is now learning how to expand itself to the large S self. And ultimately that's the goal of the Sufi, and that's called fana. That's called effacement. And that's what effacement is really based on. And that practice comes through the control of the breath over the atomic system. And that's the integration of the cognitive and the emotion. So that in esoteric practices, you're right about that. We don't separate them out in the Sufi esoteric studies. We integrate them. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. one part of the third question I think is interesting is, are there certain emotional states in Sufism that are different than or not recognized by traditional Western views on emotion? We talk about love and anger and hate and jealousy and greed and joy, happiness. Are there other states that the Sufis would point to and say, oh, well, yeah, and there's that, and then there are these other types of states of emotion, or in this case, emotion cognition?
There are occurrences in the dervish that are historically annotated through the Mevlevi school of the whirling dervish that came from Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, in which the dervish reached states of ecstasy to such a degree that they not only transformed and transited their own nafs, understanding of self, but they also transformed the whole community, such as Maulana did. And his love for Shams, for instance, his emotional experience with Shams was one of these transformative experiences that was community-wide. His effect on the world. I mean, this is a 12th century poet who is alive and well today. And more people are understanding Maulana's poetry today than ever before. I consider that quite extraordinary as a phenomenon. As a person watching how the dervish can transfer the experience of ecstasy throughout centuries and reach the people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. The interesting experience with Maulana and Shams brings this to the forefront because I don't see in our understanding of cognitive and behavioral therapies a real understanding of the ecstatic state, or the state of what I would call in Sufism divine union, or the maqam in which the state is so recognized. I see it in the Indian culture because of the sadhus and the great arhats and the masters who have reached the divine state of exaltation. But I don't see it so much in the West. And I'm wondering if we really do have experiences of exaltation under the stresses and strains of our deep, of our community ethos of work and family requirements, that are so stressful on the personality.
Yeah. And we have different experiences, like unitive experiences and different transcendent experiences, but those may be different than what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about something that relates more to samadhi.
Yeah.
In the Indian terminology.
Right.
So if we were to relate these ecstatic experiences that Maulana had with Shams, he was. I often think of this vision of him in the marketplace when after Shams was taken from him, and he went out wandering in this state of grief. And he, would just spin around, just totally looking for Shams. And I remember a vision. I can't remember what ancient story I read, but he was walking in a marketplace one day in the streets, and he was surrounded by a crowd of people, and he thought in the slightest area of his being that he heard Shams calling him, and he began to turn his head. And then it seemed like the voice was coming from another direction, and he turned again, until he was spinning in the marketplace. And that is how the whirling dervish began. Is that he was looking, he was using the ocular centers, the oral centers rather not ocular, the oral centers, the hearing, to call the beloved back to him. And then he started spinning, and then went in a state of ecstasy. And in that ecstasy, and in that samadhi, he met Shams, and he knew that they were never separated, and that from that point on, the ecstatic state became the unified state where emotion, cognition, and physical atomic being were utterly composed as one.
So nothing separated out. It actually collapsed into.
That's right. It collapsed into that work that he later, the Diwan de Shabriz, of Shams Tabriz, that Diwan, that poem to Shams, in which he showed the state of that complete and utter absorption. And that was the end of his grief. It was that one, that component. And that actually identifies the purpose behind the Sufis' esoteric methodology. That goes back to the what is called Fanafi Rasul or Fanafi Lillah, which is effacement in God direct. So actually he was effacing in Shams, but Shams was the catalyst that took him into Fanafi Lillah, which was effacement into the divine. And he was completely and utterly united in the perfect tawil, which is what is the exegetical purpose of Holy Quran and Masnavi. Masnavi is the key to tawil in Holy Quran, which is the unity of the effacement of the self in the real. So the principle of what Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi is showing to the world is incredibly important for us when we're looking at psychology. Because ultimately, as we identify each section in cognitive psychology of what each section of our anatomic being is doing, the Sufi from many thousands of years ago were always trying to unite it. It seemed like the propensity was always there to bring it apart for understanding. And I think that would be very true about the human nature itself and the exploration of things. As Hegel said, we have to go to the dualistic principles and separate in order to understand the dialecticism of it.
Yeah.
I mean, that is, I think, a really important piece of understanding that.
Something struck me about what you were saying, that in going into the ecstatic union, Rumi lost his grief for Shams, the grief of losing Shams. And I wonder about what is it that was lost? What the grief? What was that? What was it that was lost through union? Does that make sense? I mean, he lost his grief, and so there's something about the characteristic of ecstatic union that changed him emotionally. He went to a different level of being.
I understand what you're saying.
So
I think the word loss might not be prevalent here. I think loss in the sense that it integrated. It integrated. There is finally, when we start talking about coming to a more cosmic view, that of samadhi and tawheed, unity with the divine, or fanafi lillah, unity with God. It is said that in Sufi terms that everything matters and yet nothing matters. There is no event so small or insignificant that it does not have some level of karmic effect on the person, to use a Hindu term. It is also true that events might agitate us emotionally and cognitively and somatically. We will have these issues. But what is cause for amazement among Sufis is that state of calm that comes with proximity of the divine. And that state of calm is very much the state that one sees in sadhus in India. Certainly I've seen it when I've been around incredibly advanced practitioners who have spent their lives in dedicated awareness. when they enter samadhi, the peacefulness that is around them, the state of abiding love that you feel is so somatically affecting on my atoms of my body. My only response is to sit and kneel at their feet. Because I think we are all yearning on some level for that deep safety and comfort of that tranquil state. And one can feel it in the union. And I believe what Maulana lost was the agitation of his grief. And he found instead the great calmness and unity of his love instead. So, yes, he did lose, but he lost something that would have fried him to the max that he continued it. He could have gone mad. Maybe he did go mad by losing it. We don't know. We don't know. But if his poetry is evidence of his madness, may it live forever. Then that's the kind of madness I would truly desire more than anything. But you follow what I mean?
And to put it another way, the longing had been fulfilled.
That's right, the longing. So that's another aspect of the emotions. Because ultimately the methodology in esoteric practice around the emotion cognition is that we offer, the Sufis offer methodologies for tranquilizing the desire body, so that by mantram, this is in every path, actually every wisdom tradition has that. And I think many students ask me, why do we have to do all these repetitions? What is this repetition about? And it's actually to hinge the cognitive faculties so that they're not rampantly going off. To hinge them. And when you do mantram, you are learning how to hinge through your breath and through your volition, your willpower, to hinge on something that carries you. And then in meditation, you just reside in the flow of that of which you hinge to. You allow the horse to drive you, carry you the cart.
By hinge, do you mean to? Let go. In a Buddhist term, let go of the attachment to the emotion, to not hold on to.
Yeah, that's right. Not cling. They use the term clinging in Buddhism. That's right. So that you uncling. Okay. You uncling, and it's like I'll give you a very good practice in methodology. If you would close your eyes, you can do this internally, and just breathe into your inner image in your heart the picture of one rose on a long stem. And then as you look at this rose, you are breathing into the rose. You just breathe into the picture of this rose. And as you breathe into the picture of the rose, notice everything about the stem of the rose. And go up from the very bottom of the rose and go up the stem and look at every thorn. And then look at how the leaves form and how the rose sits in its little three-pronged pocket that holds it. And then see each of the petals of the rose as you examine this beautiful rose. And by holding the rose in place, the object is to breathe, aware with your volition that you are seeing this rose and that you are examining and delicately allowing your inner eye to go over every aspect, subtle aspect of this rose. And impress the color that you love very deeply into your mind. And now let us take this practice as the constructive path to the rose. Now let us do the deconstructive path to the rose. With the breath in place, begin to go to the very bottom of the stem of the rose and begin to remove it, erase it, begin to very slowly move up the stem of the rose as though you were working with an eraser, and begin to take the stem and every thorn off the rose, and then go to the little 3-prong section holding the rose and remove each of the 3 of the little prongs, and all that you have now is the budded, the opened rose with its petals, and begin to remove every petal. Begin to remove the petals. And watch your breath as each breath takes a petal off of the rose. And when finally there is no rose there, enter the scent of the rose and stay there. Now, this practice can go on at a lengthy and very deep practice. So that is how the Sufi methodology builds the constructive element of the inner breath with volition and emotion. Because the beauty of a rose brings up a certain emotion, and your breath holds you to construct the emotion. But as you deconstruct it, what you go into is the refined or subtle aspect of the rose, which is the fragrance, and you sit within. Now that which you just experienced in this practice is what the Sufis call the finer vibratory element of the emotions. That's where the refinement of the emotion comes. It's in this science that one must work with a teacher, because this is where the ideals behind esoteric teachings in Sufism are based. Does that make sense?